Good morning. Welcome to episode 27 of Tea, Coffee, and Torah. I am glad to have you with me this morning. I do have a few announcements before I get started. Number one, if you haven't seen the post, the new latest Patterns of Evidence series, the movie, is out next week. This one is the Israel dilemma. It is usually just in one, maybe two nights next week in theaters around the country. So please check your local listings. If you just Google it by name, you should see it. I also posted a link where you can actually find that video on, or that movie on the Patterns of Evidence website. So please go check that out. Number two, this is a very momentous day for Americans. This will determine kind of which way the nation will go. Will it elapse into totalitarianism, or will we seek a way to reform the system and to get back to constitutional standards? You know, there's only one party that values children and the next generation, and that values God. So please get out there. Throughout Torah, it is always in our hands to do it. And, the choices may not always be what you want, but sometimes you have to stand for what's available and work from there but be relentless. Continue to advocate. Don't stop just because there might be a temporary victory. We have to be diligent and ongoing, but please get out there, do your civic duty today, and, let's see if we can have a better 4 years ahead. Now, to get into today's material, we are looking at Jeremiah and prophet scholarship. And I have started with Jeremiah because he is one of the latest books in the Old Testament, or Tanakh. So I'm starting there. And what I'm wanting to show and demonstrate, and I hope to persuade you, is that all scholars used scholarship. But it's interesting because in their use of scholarship, it actually reveals a little bit about the original sources they would have had in their hands and in their grasp to refer to. I'm going to grab, I am on tea. This is apple tea this morning. It is absolutely scrumptious. But we're going to get into this. Now, I printed, I posted, and I'll add this to this morning's live video in the comments, but I did print, it's another 3-leaf document. Again, I don't recommend printing this, but if you want to, print it on portrait. And then all I did was I cut and taped the leaves together so that it makes a document that you can follow across. And this allows us to really see those words and phrases that are consistent throughout the text. This is a document that prophets would have consulted, and they would have quoted from when they composed their testimonies, when they composed their interpretation of divine law and of the history of Israel in the wilderness. So this is another way for us to test the text for its veracity and for its consistency. So we are going to be looking at 4 elements today. Let's see if I can do this right. 4 elements today. The elements we're going to be looking at is this particular phrase, out of the land of Egypt, the mention of Israel consistently or in some form, the Israel, people of Israel, children of Israel, your people Israel. Those are really the 3 most common forms. And also the idea of Israel being delivered with great terror. So these are the specific elements we're going to look at today. On our next class period on episode 28, we'll come back and look at different episodes different aspects of this, because there are about 9 to 10 specific elements that appear when people are specifically referring to the Exodus. Now, in the previous class, we looked at how Jeremiah in Jeremiah 2:2 stated that Yahweh had brought Israel to the wilderness to court her, to betroth her, and to marry her. Well, what the question this leaves me with when I look at Israel, Yahweh marrying Israel in the wilderness, is how does an entire society, a large group of people, end up in a desert region that is unsustainable. So if we just take those accounts and isolate them by themselves, it doesn't tell us how Israel ends up in the wilderness. We have to look at other parts of the Tanakh or rather the Torah. And what we find is that it's actually very, very consistent. We find that there are specific phrases that are always used to refer to the Exodus. Today we are able to combine all of these ideas, whether we take the ideas of the plagues in Egypt, whether we take the ideas of Israel actually leaving Egypt, whether we take the time of Israel in the wilderness and coming into the land of Canaan. Usually that whole entire period for us modernly, because we're looking back in history, over 3,000 years, we usually combine that into one word, the Exodus. But we find that the prophets actually used key phrases when they referred to the Exodus. So the first one we're going to look at is this idea of out of the land of Egypt. And this is, in Hebrew, is going to be Me'ezret, Me'ezrim, which would have been out of a land of Egypt, really is the concept there. But it's the idea that Israel is literally coming out of the land of Egypt. So we find this in Exodus 6:13. And I have highlighted these in red so you can see, and sometimes, most of the time with this phrase, it is an exact quote. Now, sometimes you can have other words that interrupt that phrase, but what it shows is a consistency of the concept. And I'm not really looking so much as to the exact words, although it is consistently an exact quote throughout the prophets. But I'm looking for the cogency of ideas, of concepts, because it's really in those ideas and concepts that reveal the doctrine, that reveal the ideas, that reveal the cultural ideas of a people and a nation in the text. So Exodus 6:13 says, and I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but I'm just going to say, unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Exodus 7:4 talks about bringing forth Israel out of the land of Egypt. And this one, if you'll look, I have armies, that is, I put in caps. We're going to come back to this in a minute. There's a reason for that. Exodus 12:17 and verse 51. So I did skip there. They're two different verses. It says, I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. And if you skip down to verse 41, it says, out of the land of Egypt by their armies, or by their garrison forces is more accurate translation. Leviticus 11:45, for I am Yahweh that brings you up out of the land of Egypt. Leviticus 19:36 talks about, I'm just going to read this whole one actually. It says, just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just tin you shall have. I am Yahweh your God, which brought or caused you to be brought forth out of the land of Egypt. So again, this idea consistently that Yahweh has brought Israel out of the land of Egypt. Leviticus 22:32 and 33. Neither shall you profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. I am Yahweh, which hallows you. I am the one bringing you forth out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh. So again, consistently, we have Jeremiah in Jeremiah 32:21, who says, and basically, God has brought forth your people Israel out of the land of Egypt. So this idea of coming out of the land of Egypt is so consistent throughout the prophets, because today we're looking at this phrase within the Torah. Over the next couple classes, we're going to expand this to see how Jeremiah and other prophets not only quote from divine law, but they also quote from other prophets, and they reissue, and sometimes you can see the evolution of a particular phrase based on how the prophets used it. The other thing that you will notice in this, and this is the second element, so the first element is going to be out of Egypt. The second element is there is always a reference in some way to Israel. For Jeremiah, it's your people Israel in Exodus 6:13. This can be the children of Israel in Exodus 7:4 and Exodus 12:17 and 51. It's my armies and my people, the children of Israel. So here the concept is again reiterated. And almost every reference, there are some that are missing it, refer to Israel as the entity that is being brought up out of the land of Egypt. So it is definitely clarified that it is specifically referring to the nation of Israel. Now, the other thing that we find is a two words, and the words are always the same. It is with signs and with wonders. And the signs, the word for sign here is ba'otot. And it is a sign. It is something that is, it can refer to the sealing of a covenant, but it can also refer to something like a portent or a miracle. But really what gives more leeway to the idea of a miracle is going to be the word that's translated as wonders. And I will say this is one of the few times that in the KJV or in translations where it is pretty consistently translated as signs and wonders. And the word for wonders is going to be umebeftim. And again, my speaking Hebrew is not the best for me, but it is the idea that the thing that has occurred is miraculous. It is something that it's a wonder. It's something that makes you in awe of what the deity has done. And then the other word that, and it's weird, it's always separated. It never appears right. Well, I can't take that back. In a couple places, it does appear right with signs and wonders, but there's usually a phrase that interrupts the idea of with great terror. And the word for great terror is a synonym, and it's ubimoroha. And again, apologies for speaking the Hebrew here, but it's ubimorora. And this is the idea that it was something that was terrifying. It was something that was awe. It was in Egypt. You would say, the phrase that you would hear if you were in Egypt is, never had the like been done. And that would be, we'll get into that at another time when we start comparing these ideas to ancient Egypt in the New Kingdom and how these actually do intersect and allow these ideas to be placed in a very historical context. So what we find, again, as we look through the ideas of signs and wonders, is that it is very consistent throughout the Torah. So all of these verses are not something that we can say was not original to an original text. They are very, very consistent. But they do actually reveal something that we're going to get back to in a minute. Now, I want to bring your attention to Deuteronomy 4:32. Because this is really the text that is closest to what Jeremiah is quoting. And I'm just going to read the whole entire text. It says, or has God assuaged to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs and wonders, and by war. The word war. And by a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, according to all that Yahweh your God did for you in the land of Egypt before your eyes. Now, here we have the idea that there was war, perhaps even as early as the time of the Exodus out of Egypt. In both Exodus 4:2 and in Exodus 12, we have the idea that Israel came out of Egypt by their garrison forces. And this puts it in a very strong historical context, because Israel's armies in Egypt would have served under Pharaoh. They would have been well trained, and they would have worked for Pharaoh, and they were probably divided as their own people. They would have been divided as Hebrews in Egypt, separate from the Egyptians, but still served under the Egyptians. And it's interesting because in my original book, Yahweh Exists Volume 1, I put forth the possibility that when this angel of death comes throughout the land of Egypt and they mark the doors to their houses, that this very well could be an opposing army that is actually coming through the land of Egypt and slaughtering the native Egyptians, or rather the usurping Egyptians. When you put it in the context of the Hyksos, that's really what you find, is that people had come in from Canaan during a time of famine, and they had usurped the native Egyptians. So this phrase of war and armies out of Egypt could be referring to that historical context. Now, as we continue, you find that Yahweh, again in Deuteronomy 6:21 through 23, there's the idea of Yahweh bringing us out of the hand of Egypt. You find there's, again, signs and wonders, and there's great terror. Now here, the word for terror is a different phrase. It is with great evil. I believe the Hebrew there is ha'ara, which is something that is very, very evil. And this was not necessarily evil for Israel. This was evil for Egypt and for the Egyptians. Now, all of these phrases read to Yahweh's wonders, to signs and wonders, to great terrors in Egypt. All of this makes no sense. It's like you're left wondering, okay, what is this referring to? What is this all about? The only place in scripture that you really, other than the Psalms, that you find context for what these signs and wonders and terrors were that brought them out of the land of Egypt is going to be in Exodus, verses about 3 through 12. Those are the only places where you find that there's plagues that would have been incredible signs and wonders. And if you remember from the text, that is only the first 3 plagues that affect Israel. After that, their land is separated, the Israelites are spared, and the rest of the plagues fall on Egypt and provide great harm to the nation. And what we know archaeologically, when we look at this time period, right around 1550, 1500 BCE, is that there was a collapse in civilization that occurs right at this time period. You have massive collapse in population, and you also have, sorry about that, you also have other things within the Exodus story that really fill in the blanks. Now, in Exodus 7:18 through 19, we find something that we have seen before. We've seen this in Jeremiah. Twice we've seen this in Jeremiah. And this is, we find this call to remember. And this is what it states in Deuteronomy 7:18 and 19. It says, "You shall not be afraid of them, but shall remember what Yahweh your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. The great trials," again, we have this idea of trials, "which your eyes saw, the signs and wonders, the mighty and outstretched arm whereby Yahweh brought you out." So here is the idea of being brought out again. "So Yahweh your God shall do to all the people whom you are afraid." So in Deuteronomy 7:18 and 19, we have an appeal. And the Hebrew here is zakar, an appeal to remember what had happened previously. And this is also, I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is an appeal to an earlier text, something that would have recorded this history. Now, even though Israel would have lived it and their people would have been there, it is usually almost always, if we look at Egypt and Egyptian records, those things are always written down. They are memorialized. Probably a concept that is more historically accurate would be a written memorial. Today we call it history, but back then they would have called it a memorial, something that, just stated what happened. Then we go to Deuteronomy 26 verses 89. "I am Yahweh who brought us forth out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror, with signs and with wonders. He has brought us up out of this place and has given us this land, even a land that flows with milk and honey." So again, we find all these concepts are there. And we're going to get into the other specific aspects and the other specific phrases that are quoted in episode 28 and probably episode 29. But in each case, we find that Jeremiah uses what would have been scriptural scholarship, a scholarship that is very like the scholarship we use today. He quoted from original sources, and we find that within these sources that he doesn't necessarily quote from, like verbatim, but he paraphrases and he puts it in his own words. The other thing that I think it's very important to note is that the earliest references, and I would say that probably what would have been written during the time of Moses or maybe the early days of Joshua, always refer to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And this is because the fear of Pharaoh would have been very, very much on the hearts and minds of those Egyptians who were fleeing Egypt. As you get into later history, this emphasis on Pharaoh really dissipates. It fades into a memory, and it is not as pronounced as it was originally. So that's where we're going to end it today. We're going to pick up with more aspects and more strains that really come through the text. But I also want to put this forward for your consideration. I think there's a lot of emphasis that I think is an assumption. And this assumption has become mainstream. And that is, number one, that Moses is the only author of Torah. Number two, that Moses has to be the only author of Torah. I think that what we're going to see as we go on, that it is more appropriate to state the scribes, the scholars who wrote under the hand of Moses. In other words, Moses would have overseen them, and you would have had various accounts. And we're going to get back into this as this class continues. We're going to look at this more in depth as to what it means to have scribes that write under Moses' authority and under his jurisdiction and his administration. So thank you for joining me this morning. Please like and share. And don't forget next week to go see where you can find the Patterns of Evidence, the Israel Dilemma in theaters near you next week. And bring your group. If you have a religious group, a church group, or a synagogue, bring them with you. And let's have a discussion on this. Thank you again for joining me, and I will see you next time.